Imagine the year is 1348, and you are a peasant in medieval France. The Black Death has just ravaged Europe, killing millions. But life for you goes on as before. You wake up with the sun and immediately start working. Your master owns everything: the house you live in, the tools you use, and even the clothes on your back. For you, food is scarce and life is hard. But there is one thing you love more than anything else in the world: freedom. And so every night before you go to sleep, you dream of a better life. A life where you own your home, where you have enough food to eat, and where you can make your own decisions. But unfortunately, it's just a dream. In reality, you are a peasant, and your life will never change. Welcome to my channel. Today we are going to explore the daily life of a peasant in medieval France. But before we begin, if you want to bring the medieval world to life in your own home, click the link below. We have designed an immersive experience that lets you and your friends become medieval villagers for the day. In the Middle Ages, peasants made up around 90% of the population in medieval Europe. They were the backbone of society, growing the crops and raising the livestock that fed everyone. But they didn't have it easy. Peasants lived in poverty and were at the mercy of their landlords, the nobility. The French king owned all the land in the country, and he leased it out to nobles in exchange for military service and taxes. The nobles, in turn, leased some of the land to peasants, who paid rent in the form of labor. Peasants also had to pay a variety of other taxes, such as a head tax for each person in their household and a tax on their livestock. Additionally, peasants were expected to provide the nobility with goods and services, such as food, lodging, and medical care when they traveled through the area. Peasants lived in small villages that typically consisted of a few hundred people. The village would have been centered around a church and a market square, with most of the houses packed together in a tight cluster. Peasants' houses were usually made of wood or stone and had thatched roofs. They were small, dark, and often smelled bad, since they were usually filled with animals. Despite these hardships, peasants took pride in their homes and would decorate them with flowers and herbs whenever possible. A typical peasant family in medieval France consisted of a man, his wife, and their children, as well as any elderly relatives who might be living with them. Men typically worked as farmers, while women did a variety of tasks, such as cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the children. Children began working as soon as they were old enough to help out on the farm. They would work alongside their parents from sunrise to sunset, planting crops, harvesting fruit, caring for animals, and repairing fences. Life was tough for peasant children, and they often had to endure hunger, exhaustion, and injury. However, they were also strong and resilient, and they learned the importance of hard work at an early age. Peasant food consisted of whatever they could grow on their small farms, supplemented by what they could hunt or gather in the wild. They typically ate a lot of grains, such as wheat, barley, and rye, as well as vegetables like cabbage, carrots, and potatoes. Meat was a rare treat, but when they did eat it, they preferred pork or poultry. Because they couldn't afford to waste food, peasants ate most of their meals cold either, because they didn't have enough fuel to cook, or because they were too busy working in the fields. Meals were often eaten while standing up, with the family gathered around a table only when it was time to share a special feast. Religion played a big role in the life of medieval peasants. They were deeply religious people who believed that God had put them in their place in life. They saw suffering as a test of faith and believed that if they endured their hardships with humility, they would be rewarded in the afterlife. The Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, and the clergy had a major influence over the peasants. Priests were seen as intermediaries between God and man, and they were responsible for teaching peasants about their religion and helping them to live good Christian lives. In addition to providing spiritual guidance, priests also provided many of the educational opportunities available to peasants. They ran schools where children could learn basic subjects like reading, writing, and arithmetic. In spite of their difficult lives, medieval peasants were not a downtrodden people. They had a strong sense of community, and they relied on each other for support. They celebrated their successes together and consoled each other during times of sorrow. They also had a deep connection to the land they lived on. They understood the rhythms of nature, and they respected the power of the elements. They knew that they were at the mercy of the weather, and they understood that their crops and livestock were dependent on the health of the soil. This connection gave them a sense of stability and continuity in an otherwise chaotic world. For peasants, life revolved around the seasons and the cycle of planting and harvesting crops. In the spring, they would work long hours in the fields, planting seeds and caring for the growing crops. During the summer, they would continue to work in the fields. But they would also take time to gather food for the winter months ahead. In the fall, they would harvest their crops and store them in barns. And in the winter, they would spend long hours indoors, eating their meager stores of food and making repairs to their homes and equipment. Medieval peasants were also very superstitious people. They believed that the world was full of evil spirits that could harm them or their families. They believed that certain animals, such as black cats and pigs, were witches in disguise. And they believed that people who died suddenly or under mysterious circumstances were victims of foul play. To protect themselves against evil spirits, peasants would carry amulets and charms, and they would avoid places that were associated with death or violence. During the medieval period, the king's officials regularly toured the countryside, inspecting the condition of the roads and bridges, as well as the behavior of the peasants. They were looking for anyone who was not paying their taxes or was breaking the law. If they found anyone who was not in compliance, they would have them arrested and taken to court. The courts were run by the king's judges. They were responsible for hearing cases involving crimes such as theft, assault, and murder. The judges were usually local nobles who were appointed by the king, and they were not necessarily qualified to hear legal cases. Trials were often held in public, and peasants were not allowed to testify in court. This meant that justice was often blind and corrupt, and peasants were frequently punished for crimes they did not commit. In addition to the king's officials, peasants also had to deal with the representatives of the Catholic Church. Priests and monks were often sent to villages to collect money for the church, and they were not above using force to get what they wanted. They also kept a close eye on the peasants' behavior to ensure that they were following the rules of the church. This meant that peasants had to be careful not to commit any sins, as they could be publicly called out by the clergy and punished. Finally, peasants also had to contend with the threat of war. During the medieval period, France was constantly at war with neighboring kingdoms. This meant that villages were regularly raided by enemy soldiers who pillaged and burned the countryside. Peasants were often forced to flee their homes and seek refuge in nearby towns or castles. When the soldiers came, they were also vulnerable to attacks by bandits and robbers, who preyed on their fear and confusion. If you enjoyed this video, here's another one about life in medieval France. And if you want to bring the medieval world to life in your own home, click the link below. Thanks for watching. And those dues often take a heavy portion of what you grow, eat, and earn. So if you are thinking about going to medieval France, maybe don't. But if you are interested in what life would have been like for the peasants who lived under the yoke of feudalism, keep watching. Life as a medieval peasant was undeniably hard. Most people in medieval Europe were peasants, a class of people who farmed the land and whose lives revolved around the seasons and the demands of the soil. They were not slaves, however, at least not in the modern sense of the word. Serfs were born free and could not be bought or sold. They also could not be whipped or beaten as chattel slaves sometimes were. Some historians even argue that the medieval peasant enjoyed a kind of freedom that we might envy. After all, they did not wake up to an alarm clock or rush to catch a bus or train to work. Their days began at sunrise and ended at sunset, dictated by the hours of daylight. They also had weekends. Peasants did not work on Sundays and often took the entire week of August off to celebrate the Assumption of Mary, among other religious holidays. And while their work was arduous, it was not uncommon for peasants to finish their labor by 4 or 5 p.m., giving them time to attend to other aspects of their lives. Peasants also often lived in villages, so they had neighbors and friends nearby and could rely on community members to help in times of need. But that's about where the perks of peasant life ended. Peasants were not free to leave their villages without the permission of their lord. This was not necessarily a problem, since the vast majority of peasants were born and raised in the village where they lived out their lives. However, if a peasant decided to travel, perhaps to visit relatives in another village, or to attend a fair or festival, they needed a pass from their lord, or else they could be arrested as vagrants. Lords also expected their serfs to help defend their lands in times of war, meaning peasants could be called upon to leave their homes and fight, often alongside their lord in the brutal and bloody battles of medieval warfare. On the plus side, when a peasant died, they did not need to worry about being buried under a mountain of debt. Medieval peasants did not typically accumulate much in the way of personal property, save for clothing, tools, and livestock. And most of these items could be worked off if the peasant fell into debt. What's more, if a peasant woman died in childbirth, her family would not be burdened with paying off her debts. As the saying went, the dead pays not. As we mentioned, peasants were expected to give a portion of what they grew and earned to their lord. This was called a tithe. Lords also often required peasants to work for them directly, either on the lord's tiaras or in some other capacity, such as working in the kitchens or as servants. How much peasants owed their lords varied depending on the region and the nature of their relationship with their lord. In some cases, peasants were allowed to bargain for better terms, but in others, they had no say in the matter. In the worst cases, serfs had to give half of what they produced to their lords. What a peasant earned for the lord versus what he or she kept for themselves determined how much money a peasant family had to spend on food. And while they often grew enough food to sustain themselves, there were years of plenty and years of scarcity. In lean years, a peasant might earn only a fraction of what they needed to survive, forcing them to rely on the generosity of their lord or to beg for food. In the end, then, while medieval peasant life had its perks, it was not all that different from life on an American farm in the 1930s. Hard, back-breaking work was the norm, and any hope of free time or leisure was a luxury reserved for the rich. Do you think you could live as a medieval peasant? Or would you rather live in the modern day? Let us know in the comments, and stay tuned for more medieval misadventures. The rhythm of your year is determined not by your own choices, but by obligations. In spring, you till the fields, often with a wooden plow dragged by oxen. You turn the soil, break up the clods, and make ready for planting. The work is hard, back-breaking, but it must be done or go hungry for the year. When the rains come, you plant. You drop seeds into the furrows and cover them over, hiding them from the birds. Then you pray for rain, for storms, for sunshine, for wind. In summer, you reap. You cut down the grain with a sharp sickle and bind it in bundles to dry. Endless rows of wheat and barley, rye and oats. They stand heavy with the promise of life and sustenance. You lay out your claim on strips of land belonging to the Lord or the church, where you can plant and harvest. You also have to pay rent in produce to the owner. But first, you set aside a large share of your harvest for the Lord and the church, tithes for the roof, as they say. Only then can you think of feeding your own family. In autumn, you gather the harvest. Store it carefully in your granary, in wicker baskets or wooden bins, protected from vermin and rot. If your lord's stores are running low, you may grind his or her corn too, in your own mill. For this, you take a toll in grain from every sack you grind. Your children run through the fallen leaves, gathering nuts and acorns for the long winter ahead. If you're lucky, you hunt rabbits or catch fish in the stream. If you have a cow, a pig, or a chicken, you may slaughter it now and preserve its meat for the lean months. The chill wind carries the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat, reminding you of what you do not have. Down the winter comes, and the land lies frozen under a hard crust of ice and snow. Hunger presses hardest. Every day you wake up famished and eat breakfast late in the morning. No one is hungry at night, so no need to rise before sunrise. These are lean times, cold times. You huddle around a small fire in your wattle and daub hut, trying to keep warm. The fire has to be small, though, or you will burn your meager stores of wood. Meals are meager, too. You eat bread made from rye or barley, often dark and coarse, and you dip it in the last of your ale or in rainwater collected from the roof. Sometimes you spread a thin layer of cheese or dried meat on your bread, or you use a little honey from your store to sweeten your drink. Once a week, maybe less, you eat pottage. Pottage is a simple stew of grains and beans and whatever vegetables are at hand. Cabbage, carrots, onions, leeks, garlic. It sticks to your ribs and keeps you just a little warmer in the fierce cold. Meat is rare. In all the villages, only the very rich eat much meat, and that only on Sundays or during great festivals. For ordinary folk, meat is a luxury. You might eat it once a month, once a year, or maybe only when you steal it. If desperation drives you to it, and if you can catch the animal and prepare it quickly enough, rabbit is the easiest prey. If you're a good hunter, you snare a wild boar, an ox, or a deer. If there's a full moon, hares are easy to catch. If there's been a storm, fish will be washed up on the shore. But fish and wild animals belong to the king or the lord. They are royal venison or the lord's venison, and stealing them is punished severely. Still, sometimes you have to steal, and the punishment is better than hunger. When you feel too weak to work, you drink ale, weak and sour, but safer to drink than water from streams that carry disease. To help your aching bones, you might brew a healing herbal beer with juniper berries or fresh thyme gathered in the fields. In these dark months, spirits run high. You play games, tell stories, sing songs, and dance to fiddle music. You dream of spring, of new life, of warmth, and light returning to the world. You look forward to Easter, to Whitsun, to Lammas Day, to Michaelmas Day, to Christmas. The days are long and hard, but people live for the festivals, for the celebrations, for the feast. And after the winter, everything changes. The world is reborn. It is a miracle that happens every year, and you are glad to be alive to see it. Work is relentless. Some days you labor in the fields, bent over rows of crops until your back aches. Other days you repair fences or gather firewood or maintain the roads. And when your own work is done, you must perform the forced labor on the Lord's land. Perhaps you are summoned to build part of a mill or to carry stones for the repair of a manor wall. Refusal is not an option. Then there are the dues and taxes. A portion of your harvest goes to the Lord. Another portion goes to the priest to sustain the local church. If you grind your grain at the mill, you must pay a fee. If you bake bread in the communal oven, there is a tax. If you marry, the Lord may demand a payment for granting approval. In every corner of life, obligations shadow you. Even the simplest of joys are tinged with anxiety. When a peasant girl prepares to dance at a festival, she does not simply put aside her daily worries and twirl in carefree abandon, even in her merriment. She is acutely aware that her every move is being watched by a watchful Lord, who may take offense at the least provocative step. For a peasant, life is a tightrope walk between defiance and submission. There is no safety net. Any misstep could bring down on one's head the Lord's harsh justice. A peasant might dream of owning a cow, a valuable beast that gives milk and can be used to plow the fields. But such dreams are often cut short by the realities of life. The sturdy ox that the peasant has coveted may cost more than the peasant can earn in a year's labor. Or perhaps a sudden illness strikes the family, and all their savings are drained in the purchase of medicine. No matter how hard they work, the peasants find themselves trapped in a cycle of crushing obligations and impossible dreams. They are caught in the gears of a system that grinds their existence into a monotonous routine, day after day. The peasants know that they are not free. They are bound to the land, to their lord, to tradition, custom, and a rigid social order. Their lives are governed by forces beyond their control, by the seasons, the capriciousness of a monarch, the whims of a merchant, the demands of a landlord. Yet within this rigid structure, they find ways to express their individuality. They pass down stories and songs through generations. They form tight-knit communities, offering mutual support and a sense of belonging. And in the quiet moments, perhaps while mending a fence or tending a small garden plot, they dream of a different life. A life where the burden of obligation is lighter, where the sun shines a little brighter, and the soil yields a bountiful harvest. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, the peasants return to their homes. Each with their story of toil and tribulation, of hopes deferred and dreams carried on. They are the unseen, the unheard, the backbone of a society that often takes their sacrifices for granted. They are the peasants, and this is their song, a song of sweat and soil, of struggle and survival. A testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of relentless adversities. Life for the peasants was a constant negotiation between complete obedience and open rebellion. They knew that the system that held them in its grip was unjust, that the privileges and freedoms enjoyed by the nobility and the clergy were denied to them. They saw the lavish feasts in the manor house and the humble portions served to them. They heard the laughter and music echoing from the halls of the Lord, and the silence that fell over their own modest gatherings. They felt the weight of the Lord's gaze upon them, judging their every action, every word, and yet they endured. Peasants were not a homogeneous mass. They were not merely robots performing their predestined tasks. They were individuals, each with their own story, their own hopes, their own dreams. They had their own internal hierarchy, their own power struggles. There were wealthy peasants who owned a few extra acres or a valuable animal, and there were landless laborers who worked for the wealthy peasants or the Lord directly. Despite these internal divisions, they also had a shared identity, collective consciousness of their common lot, their shared oppression under the rigid social order. And this consciousness, this sense of shared destiny, was the seed from which rebellion sometimes sprouted. Medieval peasants lived brutal, short lives full of back-breaking work, disease, and starvation. Life was terrible, but there were still moments of joy. What were the good things in life for a medieval peasant? There were small moments of relief. A festival day when the village gathered, music from a fiddle, a shared jug of ale passed among neighbors. Church bells marking Sundays, reminding you of faith and the hope of something better beyond this life. The rhythm of prayers, of planting and harvesting, of birth and burial, ties you to a community that endures despite the burdens. But winter is cruel. Imagine the cold settling into your hut, the wind snaking through cracks in the wall. Your family cowers together for warmth, and food supplies grow thin. Fevers, coughs, the wasting hunger that gnaws at children. Death is never far. It is not shocking here, but woven into the fabric of everyday life. But when spring returns, hope returns with it. The cycle begins anew, a newborn babe in the family, new life on the farm. There's something powerful about the vernal equinox, the promise of longer days and warmer weather. And as the snow melts and the rains come, the world awakens. The ice in the river breaks, the birds return, the leaves bud on the trees. All around you, nature is rejoicing. This is a time of renewal, a chance to start over. You work from dawn till dusk, planting the fields, sowing the seeds of the future harvest. The rain falls and the sun shines. You feel the earth beneath your feet, smell the fresh-turned soil, taste the wind on your lips. These are the tastes and textures of life. The work is hard, back-breaking, but it must be done. If you do not plant now, you will not eat later. As the weeks pass, the plants grow, the crops take shape. The sun climbs higher in the sky, the days grow longer, warmer. In the evenings, you gather with your family around a simple meal of bread and cheese, perhaps a bit of meat if you're fortunate. The children play at your feet, their laughter echoing in the twilight. You tell them stories of brave knights and daring adventures. They look up at you with wide, adoring eyes. For a moment, you forget the aches in your bones, the hunger in your belly. In this moment, you are alive, and summer arrives, a glorious, bountiful time. The fields are ripe for harvest, the fruits of your labor. You and your fellow villagers work side by side, singing as you go. The grain is cut, the barns are filled. There is enough to store for the winter, enough to share with your neighbors. And there will be a celebration, a feast of thanks to the Almighty for this good fortune. The year has its rhythms, the seasons turning, planting, and harvesting, birth and death, feast and famine. You have endured the cold, dark days of winter. You have seen the newborn lambs frolicking in the spring. You have worked in the hot sun of summer. Now autumn has come with its cool breezes and the promise of plenty. The cycle continues. Life ebbs and flows, but always there is hope for a better tomorrow. This is a story from our series. If you want to hear more stories like this one, please subscribe. The sun cracks the spine of the sky, spilling light and warmth across the fields. It is good. Another day to live, another day to work, another day closer to death. For a serf in feudal France, there was no difference between summer and winter, no change between the seasons. Your existence is one of endurance. The idea of freedom, true freedom, is nearly unthinkable. Escape is nearly impossible. Serf who runs risks being hunted down, punished, or forced back. The only true escape is through revolt, a dangerous, desperate act, or through death. When perhaps your soul may rest beyond the toil of the fields, and yet life continues. The rhythm of the seasons presses forward, steady and unyielding. You rise each day, shoulder your burdens, and work not only for survival, but for the small comforts. A loaf of bread, a warm fire, a child's laughter, the faint comfort of a prayer whispered at dawn. This is the life of a serf in feudal France. Now let us begin. The rooster crows, the chapel bell chimes, and with the first light of dawn, a new day begins for the serfs of feudal France. It is a day like any other, filled with the promise of backbreaking labor under a sky that seems both indifferent and vast. Life on the manor is regimented and relentless. The rhythms of sowing, tending, and harvesting dictate the year, offering little respite from the endless cycle of work. Sleep is a brief respite, snatched between the demands of the night watch and the early morning chime that heralds the start of another workday. The fields stretch out, a monotonous expanse of gold and green under the unrelenting gaze of the sun. Here, amidst the crops, the serfs find their days measured not in hours, but in the slow, aching progress of their work. The heavy scythe cuts a swath through the tall grasses, each stroke a testament to their tireless labor. The soil, their only confidant, bears witness to their sweat, their hopes, their dreams, and their despair. With every weed pulled, every grain threshed, they inch closer to their meager sustenance. A loaf of bread, a handful of berries, a taste of the very earth they till. The manor house looms in the distance, a symbol of the life they cannot touch. Within its high walls reside the lord and his family, living a life of relative luxury, oblivious to the toiling masses who sustain them. The contrast is stark, the inequality suffocating. Yet life goes on. Children are born into this world of servitude, their tiny hands already gripping the promise of a life of labor. The old, too, find solace in the familiarity of it all. Their gnarled hands, knowing the feel of the soil, the seed, the plow. For them, the fields are not just a means of survival, but a cemetery of memories, each furrow holding the grave of a loved one long gone. The village, a cluster of thatched huts, offers little respite from the harsh realities of their existence. Within its close confines, the serfs find a fleeting sense of community, a shared sorrow, a silent understanding. Here gossip travels fast, news of a harsh winter, an unfaithful wife, a stolen pig, the price of a daughter sold into servitude. In the flickering light of a hearth, they share tales of a better world, a world beyond the manor. A world where freedom might be a tangible thing, where the soil is not their prison, and where the sun, instead of being a relentless taskmaster, is a silent observer of their quiet rebellion. As the years pass, the serfs endure. They laugh, they cry, they love, they die, all while tethered to the land that owns them. Their lives, though brutal and confined, are not without dignity. They find pride in their work, in the bounty of the land they cultivate. They find joy in the simplest of things, a shared meal, a song at the village feast, the solidarity of their plight. They endure because they must. Escape is a distant dream, a luxury denied to them by the rigid chains of their society. But within those chains, they forge a life, a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity. After the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1353, it's a brutal defeat for the French, the English began to raid deep into northern France. They pillaged through the countryside, burning villages and taking prisoners, and so the English were hated. But they weren't the only ones. The French nobles also hated the English, which made them extremely unpopular. To make matters worse, the French king at the time was planning to end the war by selling his daughter into marriage with the heir of the English throne. Many French nobles felt this was a dishonorable way to end the war, so some started plotting to kidnap the young princess, forcing her to marry someone else instead. The plots failed, but they did cause King John to flee to Normandy in disguise, where he hid in a monastery until his enemies were defeated. While the king was gone, noble lords took control of the government and raised taxes to pay for the war. The peasants, who were already miserable, hated the king and the nobles. So when rumors spread that John had been captured by the English, many peasants thought, good riddance. They didn't care who sat on the throne after him. Their lives would continue to be miserable either way. But then something remarkable happened. The peasants decided they had had enough. They wanted to seize the throne themselves. Led by a mysterious figure named Wat Tyler, they marched on Paris, looted the city, and forced the king to meet with them. He agreed to meet their demands, including reducing taxes and giving peasants more rights. But once order was restored, he broke his promise. Meanwhile, Wat Tyler's head ended up on a pike in Paris, and soon the Jacquerie was over. By the end of the summer, most of the rebels had been killed or captured. Those who survived fled to the forests and swamps where they became outlaws, living outside the law. Historians have debated for centuries why the Jacquerie happened when it did. Some say the English were solely responsible because their raids devastated the French countryside and made the war real for the peasants. Others blame the French nobles for being greedy and raising taxes too high. Still others argue that both sides are responsible, or that neither side is responsible, and the rebellion was simply a product of the miserable times. In the end, it doesn't much matter who is to blame because the Jacquerie shows us how terrible life was for the peasants. They had to work long hours for almost no pay. They couldn't leave their village without permission. And if they did, they had to pay a special tax. If they got sick, there was no help for them. And if the crops failed, they would go hungry. They were completely dependent on the nobles for mercy. And if the nobles weren't willing to give it, they had no recourse. To be fair, things could have been worse. Most of the time, the nobles kept order in their domains. They built schools and hospitals, they funded construction projects, they held tournaments and festivals, they were generous with their charity. Occasionally, they even went to war to protect their peasants. Sometimes they even liked their peasants. There were rare occasions when peasants were allowed to buy their freedom and become, well, not nobles, but at least free men. In fact, one of the most famous heroes of the peasants' revolt was a knight named Simon de Montfort, who sided with the rebels against his fellow nobles. Still, life for the peasants was miserable, and there were few ways out. You couldn't become a noble, but you could become a monk or a nun. You could take vows of poverty and chastity and spend your life praying and working for the church. Of course, this meant leaving the village and its problems behind, but it was better than life as a serf. So many peasants chose it. And this brings us back to Wat Tyler, the mysterious leader of the peasants' revolt. Who was he? We don't know. There are legends that he was a monk or a priest or an aristocrat who was disgraced. But these legends are just that, legends. The truth is, we know nothing about him except that he led a revolt, became a martyr, and eventually became a legend. It may be easy to mock the peasants today, to call them ignorant and superstitious, or to blame them for their miserable condition. But the truth is, they lived in a world that most of us today can't even imagine. A world where life was short and brutal, and where death was always waiting around the corner. The Jacquerie reminds us that even the most oppressed people have the strength to fight back, even if they don't win. Today, the story of the Jacquerie is remembered in France as a sad but glorious moment in their history. A time when ordinary people dared to defy the odds and stand up for their rights. Imagine yourself as one of these peasants. Your family struggles to survive. Your crops are barely enough. Yet soldiers arrive demanding grain. Taxes rise again. The noble who should protect you instead retreats into his fortified manor, leaving you exposed. The frustration simmers, spreading from village to village in whispers. By late May of 1358, anger spilled into open revolt. Groups of peasants armed with whatever tools they could find, pitchforks, scythes, wooden clubs, began to march. They called themselves Jacques, a mocking nickname given by nobles derived from Jacques Bonhomme, meaning good Jack, a term for the common peasant. To the nobility, it was an insult. To the peasants, it became a badge of defiance. At first, their actions were chaotic. They attacked manor houses, tore down fortifications, and burned records that bound them to servitude. But soon, as if guided by some grim reaper, they headed for the very heart of noble France. As the Jacquerie advanced, a wave of terror and anger washed over the countryside. Villagers fled, barricading themselves in the strongest houses or escaping into the fields. The Jacques, in turn, found plenty to plunder, relieving the peasants of their tithes and burning the grain that the nobles had seized. It was a desperate bid for survival, a violent response to centuries of oppression. But amidst this chaos, something remarkable was born. A rough and ready peasant army was taking shape, now led by a charismatic preacher named Jean the Jacquerie, though still lacking in discipline and organization, was beginning to pose a serious threat. Entire villages rose up, joining the revolt and swelling the ranks of the Jacquerie. Farmers, shepherds, domestic servants, and day laborers. All driven by the same desperate need for change, all united in their hatred for the nobility. And as their numbers grew, so did their audacity. The Jacquerie attacked supply convoys, ambushed isolated noblemen, and even dared to lay siege to towns. It was a brutal, terrifying campaign, but also one of astonishing courage. These were men and women who had known only drudgery and despair, yet now they were fighting back against an oppressive system that had held them down for generations. And they fought with a ferocity born of desperation, hacking at the knights with their sharpened tools, hurling stones and boiling oil from makeshift catapults, screaming defiance at the soldiers of the king. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the tables had turned. The nobility, caught off guard by the ferocity of the uprising, struggled to respond. The knights, with their heavy armor and cumbersome weapons, proved no match for the Jacquerie's crude but effective tactics. And as the peasants pressed their attack, it looked as if this ragtag army might actually win. But as we know, history doesn't always align with our hopes. In the end, the Jacquerie was crushed. Jean was captured and executed, and many of the peasants were killed or imprisoned. But their story didn't end there. The memory of the Jacquerie, of the commoners who dared to defy the nobility and fight for a better life, lived on. In fact, the Jacquerie inspired later peasant revolts, reminding people that even the most oppressed could rise up and fight back. Now, here's what I want you to do. Close your eyes and imagine yourself as one of these peasants. You have just finished a hard day's work in the fields. Your hands are dirty, your body is aching. But as you look up at the smoke rising in the distance, you feel a spark of hope ignite within you. Perhaps things are about to change. Perhaps you and your fellow peasants will finally be able to live a better life. What do you do next? What would you do? This is a pivotal moment in history, a moment when the course of the future could change. Will you join the Jacquerie and fight for a better life? Or will you stay on the sidelines and watch as others take their chance for freedom? The choice, my friends, is yours. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. It really helps me create more videos like this. And if you want to learn more about the Jacquerie, I've included some resources for further reading. Till next time, remember, history is not just about dates and battles. It's about the people who lived it and the choices they made. And you can find out more about the French Revolution through additional resources. But such revolts rarely stayed contained. Soon the uprising spread across northern France and the Beauvais region toward Paris. Thousands joined, swelling the numbers of the Jacquerie. Their rage was directed at the nobility as a class, whom they saw as failing in their duty to protect the land. The nobility, shocked and alarmed, responded quickly. They could not allow the peasants to rise unchecked. To them, the Jacquerie was not just rebellion, but a dangerous tearing at the very fabric of feudal order. You might picture a village gathering at dusk. Word spreads that the nobles are assembling armies. Knights, armored and mounted, prepare to march against the peasants. The peasants, though numerous, are ill-equipped. They wield farm tools against steel swords. Their courage comes from anger, not training. The Jacquerie, like other peasant revolts, had no leaders of note. There were no generals to issue commands or strategize. There was no formal organization, no chain of command, just anger. What the hell do you do when peasants with pitchforks take up arms against you? When you're a medieval lord, you call another lord, and together you raise an army and crush them. So the nobility assembled their men, and when the knights came, it was over quickly. Peasants were mowed down by steel swords and armored knights. Their revolt, like those before them, was put down. Order was restored. The nobles had triumphed. This painting is called The Death of Coster by Dutch Golden Age painter Rembrandt van Rijn, finished in 1632. It depicts the death of a peasant revolt leader named Coster, also known as the Shepherd of Flanders. In the painting, we see Coster and his two sons moments before their deaths. Armed men close in on them. One of Coster's sons has already fallen, mortally wounded. The other stands with his arms raised in a gesture of surrender. But it's too late. His father is dead, kneeling as if in prayer. His head is resting on a pike that has been thrust through him. and this is the third time we've looked at this painting. In my first video on the subject, I used this image to introduce the concept of honor in medieval combat. I asked, what would you do if you were this man? Would you fight to the death? Would you surrender? If so, how? How does one surrender in combat? This question led us to discuss various ways of surrendering, including bearing false token, throwing down your weapons, and even holding out a white cloth. In my second video, we looked at this painting from the point of view of one of the armed men. We discussed the idea of mercy, and whether the armed men might show mercy to their kneeling captives. We also considered the possibility of the armed men being paid to carry out an execution. And now, in our third look at this painting, we consider the event from the point of view of the captives, specifically the kneeling son, who appears to be pleading for his life. He stands with his hands raised in a gesture of submission, palms out, fingers spread, open and vulnerable. His stance is one of surrender. His clothing is that of a peasant. He wears a simple tunic and hose, a far cry from the clothing worn by the nobility. His footwear is also simple, just laced-up leather boots. As we've seen in earlier videos, there were no real rules governing the conduct of battles between knights and peasants. It was a brutal affair. Medieval lords had little or no concern for the lives of those beneath them on the social scale. And so if you were a peasant, there was little hope for mercy if captured. Your fate was likely to be a quick death by steel sword or pike. At best, you might hope for a merciful death, meaning a clean killing blow that ended the fight quickly. At worst, you might find yourself executed slowly, perhaps by being hanged or burned alive. What would you do in this situation? Surrender with outstretched hands and hope for mercy, or fight to the death? Remember, the choice is yours because history is filled with your stories. Thank you for watching. Okay, if you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the channel. You can learn more about medieval combat through the series in the card above. Also, check out the podcast in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. In the heart of 14th century France, a revolt was brewing. It wasn't just another nobles' rebellion or a religious upheaval. It was a full-blown peasant insurrection. These weren't your typical French peasants, though. It endured centuries of abuse, exploitation, and downright misery. And they'd had enough. By June of 1358, thousands upon thousands of men, women and children had assembled near the town of Mello, perhaps hoping that numbers alone would protect them. What they lacked in social standing, they made up for in sheer volume. But what they didn't bargain for was the full force of the French nobility, backed by professional soldiers who descended upon the unsuspecting peasants. The result was a massacre. The nobility had no intention of negotiating or compromising. For them, these were not peasants with grievances. They were rebels, outlaws, enemies of the crown. They were about to face the consequences. The fields that once grew wheat and rye became a scene straight out of a medieval horror show. Mounted knights charged into the unarmed crowds, their lances and swords reaping a bloody harvest. Seasoned warriors hacked and slashed, enjoying the fight a bit too much if the accounts are to be believed. In a single day, thousands perished, dying where they stood or fell in heaps, only to be trampled by the surging masses. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. It was just the beginning of the end for the revolt. Those who survived this first wave of violence didn't stand a chance against the nobility. As ruthless determination to crush the rebellion, villages were punished, some burned to the ground. Leaders were taken, tried, and executed, often in the most brutal fashion imaginable. One particularly gruesome punishment involved boiling the condemned alive. Can you imagine the screams of those unfortunate souls as they were dropped into seething oil? It's a horrifying image, but it was meant to send a message to any who dared consider rebellion. Within a few short weeks, the revolt that had shaken the foundations of French society was over. As abruptly as it had begun, the peasants were scattered. The nobility reasserted their dominance, and life in France went on as before. Or did it? There's a problem with this account, a big one. It reads like a fairy tale, a story with a clear beginning, rising action, climax, and resolution. Where good the nobility triumphs over evil the peasants. But history isn't a fairy tale. It's messy, complicated, and often doesn't have neat endings. For starters, the French nobility never really faced any serious consequences for their actions. Oh sure, they got to punish a few peasants, burn a couple of villages, but that was seen as a necessary evil, a means to restore order. The real power remained with the nobles and the king. As for the peasants, they got nothing. No land reform, no reduction in taxes, no improvement in their living conditions. Life on the manor went on as before, and here's the kicker. This story isn't unique to France in the 1300s. It's a story that repeats itself throughout history. A group of people rises up against the powers that be, only to be crushed and scattered. The leaders are punished. The rank and file return to their miserable lives. Why do I keep telling these stories? Because even though we all know how they go, there's something powerful about them. There's a universality that transcends time and place. These are stories about ordinary people pushed to the edge, who then take extraordinary measures to fight back. They may not win in the end, but their struggle resonates with us because it's a story we can all relate to in some way. It's the story of the downtrodden, the marginalized, the forgotten, the ones who dare to dream of a better world, but who ultimately have to face the harsh realities of their time and place. So yes, the revolt ended in bloodshed and defeat.
Yes.
The nobility crushed the rebellion with ruthless efficiency. But in the years leading up to that, in the hearts and minds of the peasants, a fire was lit. A fire that may have been put out for now, but whose embers will smolder and one day reignite. Because no matter how many times the powerful try to snuff it out, the flame of rebellion will always burn. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider liking it. It helps the channel tremendously. Also, let me know in the comments below what you think the peasants could have done differently to improve their chances of success. And as always, thank you for watching. And yet, the Jacquerie left its mark. Though it failed, it revealed the simmering tension at the heart of feudal France. The peasants were not voiceless, nor were they endlessly patient. Their lives may have been bound to the land, but even serfs could reach a breaking point. Listening centuries later, the Jacquerie is not a story of triumph. It is a story of desperation, a reminder of how fragile life was for those at the bottom of the medieval order, and how swiftly rebellion could be crushed beneath the armored hooves of knights. But history, like the seasons, moves steadily onward. From the smoldering fields of revolt, we turn now to another shadow that shaped peasant life. The slow, relentless march of the Black Death across the countryside. Imagine if you can. A world without antibiotics, without vaccines, without an understanding of germs or hygiene. A world where the most advanced medical science has to offer is bloodletting and the application of leeches. This was the world of medieval Europe in the 14th century, and it was about to get a whole lot worse. In 1346, a ship arrived in Sicily carrying a deadly cargo. Rats infected with the bacteria Yersinia pestis. Within weeks, the Black Death would begin its gruesome procession across the Italian coast, and from there spread inexorably northward, killing all who stood in its path. The Black Death would rage across Europe over the next 5 years, carrying off an estimated 30 to 50% of the continent's population. Only the countryside, with its lower population density, was spared the worst of the plague's initial impact. In the spring of 1348, the Black Death broke out in the English village of Ma, where it killed 18 of the 22 residents. By the end of the year, an estimated 1/3 of England's entire population would be dead. The French countryside was hit even harder. One chronicler described the horrifying spectacle that greeted him as he rode through the French provinces. Fields that had been sown were rotting for lack of harvest hands. Houses were empty, their doors hanging from their hinges, their windows shattered. The very air was heavy with the stench of death, he later recalled. I have seen in some villages 12 or 13 corpses lying in the street, and the villagers who were still alive had fled and abandoned their homes. As the Black Death swept through the countryside, whole communities were wiped out, leaving behind them a desolate landscape of abandoned farms and rotting crops. The toll on the peasantry was catastrophic. Entire families were lost to the plague, their fields left untilled, their livestock turning wild in the absence of shepherds. The social bonds that had held the peasantry together, the tight-knit communities of village and parish, were sundered by death. Survivors found themselves thrust together in the desperate hope of tending their fields and harvesting what little they could from the ravaged landscape. In this atmosphere of fear and grief, Rumors began to spread that the Black Death was somehow the divine punishment of a wrathful god. Some turned to flagellation, whipping themselves in the belief that they were somehow uncleansed. Others sought solace in the church, praying for mercy or confessing their sins to a priest. Still others grew bolder, blaming the sickness on the Jews, who were widely believed to have poisoned wells to spread the disease, a claim with no basis in fact. As the plague raged across France, the French king, tired of the mounting death toll, called on his knights to do their duty, to slay the pestilence as they would any enemy of the realm. But against an invisible foe, steel and horseflesh were no match. As the summer of 1349 brought a second wave of pestilence, it became clear that the countryside could no longer bear the burden of feeding a starving population. Peasants abandoned their fields and fled to the cities, hoping to find work and food in relative abundance. But city dwellers were already struggling to cope with the rising death toll and the soaring price of grain. By the winter of 1349, the French peasantry was on the edge of starvation. When the king's tax collectors arrived demanding payment of long overdue taxes, they were met not with compliance, but with open revolt. In the village of Esnanville, a group of peasants seized the local tax collector, tied him to a nearby windmill, and beat him to death. Similar scenes played out across the countryside as the French peasantry rose up in open rebellion. The Jacquerie was over, but a new struggle was just beginning. The year is 1364, 6 years after the initial outbreak of the plague, yet the tranquility of the French countryside is about to be shattered. For many, the pestilence is just a story told by an old man. Life has returned to normal. Work in the fields, gossip at the market, festivals in the square. But for some, the nightmares have only just begun. In your village, a family is taken. One by one, they fall ill. The father coughs blood, the mother's skin turns green, their children writhe on their beds, burning with fever. You watch from afar, holding your breath, hoping it will pass them by. But the reaper has come for your friends and neighbors, and soon he will come for you. You feel the first scratch of his scythe on your arm, then on your heart. A burning chill, weakness, pain, loneliness. You're cut off from your world, wrapped in darkness and sheets. Days blur into nights. You hear the prayers of the dying and the rasp of their final breaths. When you wake, it is to an empty bed in an echoing room. The family is gone, vanished like smoke. Their fate sealed, their bodies buried in the cold ground, now nothing more than memories. This is the story of those who survived the plague, the survivors who watched as their neighbors, friends, and family succumbed to the disease. They are the living dead. Now alone in a world reshaped by pestilence, they must carry on. Days turn into weeks. The fever breaks, and you emerge from your home, blinking in the sunlight. The village is different. Some houses are empty, their doors hanging off their hinges, their windows vacant, eyes staring sightlessly ahead. You walk among the ruins of your life and wonder where everyone has gone. Was it a dream? Can this really be happening? You search for an answer, but there is none. Only the wind whispers through the empty streets, rustling the dead leaves underfoot. You find solace in the routine of your work, the familiar tasks that have always defined your life. But even here, the past intrudes. The rhythms of the fields are changed. Where once there were songs and laughter, now there is only silence. The crops still need tending, the animals still need feeding, but there is no one to help. Then you hear a cough in the night, the rattle of a fevered breath, the whisper of footsteps on the dew-kissed grass. You turn, but there is no one there. Still, the terror remains. You are not alone in these fields. The plague has left its mark on your soul, and the darkness lingers in your heart. Slowly, life begins to return.
Oh!
New families move into the village, seeking a fresh start, a new life. The fields are cultivated once more, the animals find new shepherds. But the shadow of the plague hangs over all of them. For in this new world, the old ways are gone forever. The village is rebuilding, but so are you. You emerge from your self-imposed exile, blinking at the world. But you are changed. Your world is emptier now, quieter, colder. The sun seems dimmer in the sky, the laughter of children, a distant memory. You are a survivor, marked by the plague, haunted by the dead. The world is forever changed, and so are you. Yet as the seasons turn and the years roll by, life goes on. New lives are lived, and new stories begin. The memory of the plague fades into legend, and the survivors, they become the village. They rebuild their lives and their communities, carrying the scars of the past and the lessons it has taught them, cherishing the fragility of life and the strength of the human spirit. So while the shadow of death may linger, so too does the promise of life, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable loss. And as the sun rises over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of hope, the survivors take their first tentative steps towards healing, towards remembering, and towards a future that, while forever marked by the plague, is ultimately their own. And thank you for watching. You are walking through a village, and you see the Black Death. What do you see? What do you experience? What does it look like? Well, you don't always see it coming. Sometimes it arrives in the dead of night. A cough, a swelling, a sudden fever. People die in their sleep, and in the morning they're found lying cold and stiff. Then the neighbors start to withdraw. The priests come to offer prayers, but they fall ill and die too. The doors of the houses are shuttered. The fields are left untended. The animals left behind bleat and bark and fly. The stillness of the countryside grows heavier. Even the land itself seems to hold its breath. And then you walk through the village, and you see no one. You might see an old woman sitting by the door, her eyes hollow and staring. You might see a young girl in a doorway, listless and drooling. Or you might find a family huddled together, the father holding the mother, the children cowering at their feet. You might also see the bloated corpse of a peasant slung in a blanket, carried out of his home and dumped in a shallow grave. The plague is more than a sickness. It is an interruption of everything that peasants rely upon: the sun, the moon, the stars, the seasons, their senses, their bodies, even their prayers. When too many villagers die, the crops rot in the fields. When entire families are gone, the cottages stand empty. Their hearts are cold. The fire has gone out. Walking through such a village, you would see roofs collapsing, gardens overgrown, pathways silent. The absence of life is as striking as the presence of death, and yet you keep walking. You walk past the rotting vegetables, the untended fields, the houses without light in their windows, past the old, the sick, and the dying. And what do you experience when you walk through this village? A terror! A dread so profound that your skin crawls and your blood runs cold. For everywhere around you, death is making a new world. The familiar landmarks are distorted and sinister. The church seems to leer down at you. The fountain tastes like poison. The trees writhe and twist. The wind whispers through the leaves like a dirge. The shadows of the plague stretch long and lean. They reach out and touch you. Everywhere you see the aftermath. The aftermath of what? Of a world turned upside down, of a reality shattered. Rats flee across the road, pursued by black cats with green eyes. Dogs snarl and snap at the air. A crow cries overhead. Faces of saints and angels seem to mock you. Houses buckle and shake. Graves gape and sigh. Ghosts drift through the streets. And all the while, the plague follows you like a specter at your heels. Waiting for you to falter, waiting for you to stumble, waiting for you to fall into its arms and let it consume you. Are you still walking? Because the plague is almost upon you. Can you hear it now? It is all around you. Listen, can you hear the rats scratching in the walls? Can you hear the flies buzzing in the stagnant water? Can you hear the wind sighing through the broken window panes? Can you hear the dead leaves rustling underfoot? Can you hear the voice of the plague? It is calling you. It is beckoning you. It is whispering to you. Some say the plague is God's punishment, that it is the just reward for a sinful world. Others say the plague is the devil's doing, that it is the price of progress. But most say the plague is nature's revenge, that it is the reckoning for a world that has forgotten its place. And now the plague is here. The world is broken. Reality is shattered. Nothing will ever be the same again. So, are you still walking? Do you dare to walk on? Or have you stopped? Have you fallen to your knees and surrendered to the plague? The Black Death is considered one of history's worst disasters. It wiped out 30 to 60% of Europe's population and reshaped society, economy, and culture. But what kind of world did it create? We've told you before about the social and economic consequences of the plague. For example, how it helped to end feudalism by creating a shortage of labor that gave peasants more bargaining power with their lords. We mentioned that in our episode about the Black Death, and yet, strangely, Black Death also changed the balance of power in the countryside. With so many lives lost, labor suddenly became more valuable. Surviving peasants sometimes found themselves in a new position. Lords, desperate for hands to till their fields, began offering better terms, lighter burdens, or even wages instead of traditional dues. Imagine the small, cautious hope this might bring. After generations of bondage, the chance to breathe a little freer, to negotiate, even if only slightly, with those who had always commanded. But this shift also brought tension. Nobles resisted these changes, trying to hold peasants to old obligations. Some English nobles complained bitterly of their farms being neglected, because their tenants were unwilling to work for the old, miserable wages. A lord wrote to the king begging for assistance in making his tenants, quote, "reshaped to heretofore used customs." The shift in power didn't last long. Within a few years, the surviving nobles had found new ways to make money and new people to exploit. And yet the memory of hardship and the knowledge that labor had value remained. In this way, the plague quietly loosened the old bonds of feudalism. Another consequence was the weakening of the power of the Catholic Church. During the plague, people turned away from organized religion in droves. Some blamed the church for the plague, and others simply stopped believing its comforting message that God was in control. Between 1346 and 1350, the number of clergy in England fell by 2/3. Paris, which had around 2,000 priests before the plague, had only 700 when it ended. Fewer people went to church, fewer people became nuns or monks. Religious orders, whose members took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, saw their numbers plummet. The effects rippled through the church hierarchy. Parish priests were so hard to come by that the Archbishop of Canterbury allowed unordained men to say Mass. The shortage of priests also led to a rise in anti-clericalism. One writer noted with approval that, quote, "the curates who have been appointed are not esteemed so highly as they were before." Another described how in some places the collection plate had to be passed 3 times to get enough money for the priest's stipend. People were getting pretty fed up with paying for religion. By the end of the 14th century, the papacy was in crisis. Many in England no longer felt that the Pope had any business telling them how to live. Priests were marrying and church attendance was optional. As one chronicler put it, the church was in such disarray that, quote, "no man would trust him with his soul's salvation, nor his children's, if he could help it." So, the Black Death weakened the bonds of feudalism and challenged the authority of the church. What else did it accomplish? Well, it also spurred artistic innovation. It's not exactly a silver lining, but that's one way to look at it. After experiencing the horrors of the plague, Europeans wanted art that reflected their anxieties and concerns. Painting and sculpture that had once been abstract and decorative became more realistic. Artists like Peter Bruegel, the Elder, created vivid scenes of everyday life, including, yes, a painting of the Black Death. Writers, too, began exploring new genres. Medieval romances about valiant knights and virtuous ladies gave way to stories about ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. Writers like Geoffrey Chaucer and Christine de Pizan portrayed characters who were obsessed with death, people who, like them, had seen too much death. The Black Death had an impact on science too. When the plague struck again in the 1660s, scientists began to understand that it was caused by fleas living on rats. They also learned that the disease could be spread by contaminated clothing, and that it thrived in filth and poverty. These understandings led to new public health measures, things like quarantine and isolation wards, which we take for granted today, but which were new back then. In other words, the Black Death prompted some pretty big changes, though you wouldn't know it from looking around. 3 centuries after the plague ended, Europe looked much the same as it had before. The land was still farmed by peasants, mostly on the same miserable terms. Religion was once again a fixture of daily life, and old masters had regained control of their domains. Yet underneath the surface, important changes had taken place. The Black Death had broken the medieval world in new and unexpected ways, paving the way for an early modern era. I'm the host. This episode was written by Elizabeth Ashe and edited by Kevin Dudley. The year is 1346, and Europe is dying. The Black Death has come, and with it, an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Entire villages are wiped out, their corpses left to rot in the open fields. Amidst the horror and despair, one question echoes in the minds of the dying. Why? Why are we suffering this terrible fate? They seek an answer in the skies, in the stars, in the church, and in themselves. What they find there changes Europe forever. To the peasants of 14th century Europe, life was already hard. Famine, war, and oppression were part of their everyday reality. So when the Black Death arrived, it seemed like just another tribulation to endure. But as the death toll rose and the suffering intensified, they began to look for an explanation. And what they found was both terrifying and consoling, a mystery, a punishment, a divine will. Some threw themselves into their faith with renewed devotion, confessing their sins, praying for forgiveness and protection. Others doubted the power of their prayers, wondering if God had abandoned them to their fate. What is certain is that the plague profoundly affected their relationship with God, their faith, and their culture. Pilgrimages to holy sites increased, as did the veneration of local shrines and relics. In those hushed, darkened rooms, filled with the scent of incense and desperation, the peasants found solace and answers. The Black Death was a punishment from God, yes, but also a test of their faith. Those who endured it with humility and obedience would be rewarded in the afterlife. Those who succumbed to the plague were seen as having died for their sins, for they had been purged by God Himself. The survivors felt an overwhelming need to express their gratitude, to show that they had learned from the tragedy. Throughout the countryside, people spoke in hushed voices of omens in the sky, of blood-red sunsets and sickly stars, as if the heavens themselves were weeping. They wondered if God had been angered by the sins of humanity, if the Black Death was His way of punishing an unworthy people. Was this the chastisement they deserved? Had they strayed too far from the teachings of Christ? In the small village of Elston, a hush had fallen over the countryside. The fields lay fallow, the animals left to roam the hillsides. The villagers, huddled in their homes, dared not venture out. The very air seemed heavy with the stench of death. It clung to their clothes, their hair, their skin. No amount of scrubbing or sprinkling with holy water could banish it. The church, usually bustling with activity, stood almost empty. The priest, stricken with grief, could find no words to comfort his flock. Even the hymns seemed hollow and pointless. What was the use of praying when God had turned away? The question echoed in the hearts of the villagers. They wondered if their prayers had brought them only more suffering, if their faith had somehow been misplaced. But slowly, hesitantly, they began to gather in the small wooden church. They came to kneel before the altar, to weep quietly, to stare into the flickering flames of the candles. Some confessed their sins, seeking absolution, while others simply sat in silence, contemplating the vast mystery of suffering. The priest spoke of patience, of endurance, of the divine will. He, too, was lost in the immensity of the tragedy, but he had to be strong for his people. He spoke of the need to obey God's will, to accept the suffering, to find meaning in the midst of the meaningless. His words were not those of a man who had all the answers, but of a fellow sufferer, someone who, like them, was trying to find his way in the darkness. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of the graves in the hillside. The sun, pale and cold, struggled to penetrate the thick clouds, but inside the church, a different kind of light flickered. It was the light of faith, of hope, of remembrance. For in the face of death, the peasants found a new strength, a new understanding of their faith, and a new respect for the mysteries of life. The Black Death had stripped away everything they thought they knew. Now, in the silence of their prayers, they began to rebuild their lives, their faith, and their culture, forever marked by the shadow of the plague. Now, to learn more ways the Black Death affected the world, check out the series in the description below. The Black Death is a terrifying part of history, yet it's often treated as if it were a single event, a moment in time. In reality, it was a recurring visitor. Waves of plague returned again and again, each one renewing fear and taking more victims. And so, for the peasant, life became a cycle of uncertainty. Work and harvest, then rumor and fear, then mourning and survival. a life lived always under the shadow of what might return. As centuries passed, the plague's grip slowly weakened. Villages rebuilt, populations recovered, and the rhythms of farming life resumed. But the memory remained woven into the fabric of rural France. The time when death walked quietly down the village lanes, touching doors, choosing some, and sparing others, and reminding all of how fragile life could be. From here, our journey turns once more, shifting our gaze away from the cottages and fields of peasants to the world that towered above them. The world of lords and ladies, manor houses and lavish feasts, a striking contrast to the life of a serf. Yet this, too, is a world shaped by the plague. For while the Black Death spared no one, it did have its favorites. The year is 1348, and the English town of Effingham is preparing for its annual fair. Merchants from across the realm are arriving, setting up stalls laden with fine cloths, spices, and perfumes. G's are there too, with their packs of hunting dogs, ready to take the finest hares and rabbits that the surrounding manors can send. Lord John de Shefford, his wife Joan, and their retinue are on their way to the fairgrounds in a carriage. They're joined by Lord William de Brecon, who's come to discuss a land deal with de Shefford. Both men are eager to make the most of the fair, which promises to be one of the largest and liveliest in years. And why not? The plague seems to have passed them by. No serious cases have been reported in months, and everyone is looking forward to a summer of sport and merriment. But one young man watching the festivities from a distance has other thoughts. Roger, a 25-year-old clerk, has recently come to work for Lord de Shefford. He sees the fair as a symptom of a world turned upside down, a world where people act like there is no sickness abroad when all around them people are dying. It makes him uneasy. He doesn't understand why people are crowding together when they should be keeping to their homes. He sees illness everywhere, and he worries that soon he, too, will be struck down. Little does Roger know that the plague is already at the fair, hidden in the crowds, waiting to strike. That night, Roger wakes up sweating and shivering. He feels weak and spends the day in bed. Joan de Shefford, her hand on her swollen belly, watches the new arrival, pale and listless, from the top of the stairs. She, too, is ill, but she's used to such ailments. She's had 4 children and miscarried twice in the past decade. This time, though, the fever is worse than usual. She dismisses her lady-in-waiting and climbs back into bed. The child she carries will be born soon. She must rest. Across the manor house, Lord de Shefford and Lord de Brecon are having their own troubles. Both men are struck with sudden pains and aches. The doctors summoned to treat them have no answers. Within days, both lords are delirious and covered in boils. Soon after, they're dead. Their bodies are laid out in the great hall, stiff and cold, their faces twisted in final agony. Around them, their retainers cower. They have seen enough of the plague to know that their masters are only the first victims. All they can do now is wait. From the safety of her room, Joan watches the proceedings with growing horror. She knows that she's in the last stages of pregnancy and that the sickness ravaging her husband's household could kill her, too. She goes into labor, and her first thought is of the child growing inside her. Her 5th child, the one she hopes will finally live. She names the baby John after her dead husband. And as she cradles him, she knows that this tiny life is all that stands between her and the plague. If he dies, she thinks, I shall die with him. To watch the series premiere of Life and Death in Medieval France, become a member at our website. The Manor House, noun, a grand residence, typically of a landowner or nobleman. All right, class, settle down. Settle down. While the serfs toiled in the fields and lived in modest timber cottages, another world stood nearby, the world of the manor house. It was a place of stone walls, long halls, and great hearths where lords and ladies lived in relative security. Their lives defined not by the toil in the mud, but by the rhythms of power, ritual, and leisure. Picture this, you're approaching a manor house. The building rises above the landscape, its walls imposing but not as vast as a castle's. A wooden gate creaks open, leading into a courtyard where horses are tethered and servants move quietly about their duties. The scent of wood smoke drifts from the kitchen, mingling with the aroma of roasting meats. Beyond the courtyard, a formal garden, perhaps with a fountain, offers a space for leisurely strolls. and inside the manor, a tapestry of luxury awaits. Rich tapestries adorn the walls, their designs depicting scenes from history or mythology. Gnarled, comfortable chairs are scattered around, inviting relaxation after a day's hunt or ride. Long wooden tables stand ready for grand feasts, and suits of armor, silent sentinels of past battles, guard the entrance to the Lord's private chambers. In the great hall, a massive fireplace crackles merrily, chasing away the winter chill and casting flickering shadows that dance upon the stone floor. Through an open doorway, you catch a glimpse of the lord of the manor, a man of considerable girth, engaged in a heated game of chess with one of his knights. The knight, clad in chainmail, wields his queen with surprising agility, maneuvering it across the board with deft moves that would put any bishop to shame. Opposite him sits the lord's son, a young man with the wisdom of ages 14 and the strategic brilliance of a grand master. He considers his next move, his brow furrowed in concentration. Will he trade pieces or go for a daring attack? The answer, my friends, lies in the intricate dance of strategy and cunning that is chess. Suddenly, the heavy oak door at the far end swings open, and a gaggle of children, the lord's heirs apparent, burst through, their boisterous laughter echoing through the hall. They race across the room, their eyes shining with mischief as they prepare to unleash their latest prank on an unsuspecting court. Jester, beware. As the game continues, the lord's wife, a regal woman with a sharp wit and an even sharper tongue, enters the hall. Her eyes sweep over the room, taking in the flickering firelight, the intense expressions of the players and the jester, who is now sporting a rather fetching hat made of bread. With a slight smile playing on her lips, she settles into a nearby chair, ready to observe the unfolding drama with amusement. Meanwhile, in a far corner of the manor, a young page nervously arranges flowers in a vase. He's just been assigned to serve the lady of the house, and he wants to make a good impression. But alas, his floral choices are less than inspiring. A single wilted daisy stares mournfully from a sea of greenery, offering little in the way of color or charm. Undeterred, the page straightens up and admires his handiwork, convinced that he's created a masterpiece. Little does he know that the lady of the house has a keen eye for aesthetics and a sharp tongue for those who fail to meet her. Standards, oh dear. As the afternoon wears on, the atmosphere in the great hall shifts. The jester, having escaped the wrath of the children, now entertains a small crowd with his antics. His colorful robes and motley cap, a bright spot in the dimly lit room. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps echoes through the hall, and all eyes turn to the entrance. A new arrival, a mysterious stranger, stands in the doorway, his face obscured by the shadows of his wide-brimmed hat. What brings him to the manor? Is he a long-lost relative come to claim his inheritance? A dashing young suitor hoping to win the lady's hand? Or perhaps a sinister villain with nefarious plans? The possibilities are endless, my friends, and I, for one, am eager to see how this new player will affect the delicate balance of power in the game. What will the lady of the house say when she sees the page's handiwork? How will the other nobles react to the mysterious stranger's arrival? And will the young squire ever escape the kitchen without getting caught? Find out next time on Manor House. Game of Thrones. Sorry, we'll be back next time. Thanks for watching. Step inside, and the contrast becomes even sharper. The hall is wide, with banners draped from the beams. A long table stretches down its center. At one end sits the lord, his seat raised slightly above the rest. From where he sits, he can survey his domain, keep an eye on his people, and make sure everyone behaves. In front of him, a roaring fire transforms logs into embers, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney breast and floating away on the breeze. The hearth is a place of warmth and light, but also of shadows and secrets. The flickering flames dance and weave between the faces around it, highlighting the silver in the lady's hair, the lord's tired eyes, the nervous energy of the young page. Each face is lit and obscured in turn, as if the fire itself is interrogating them, demanding they reveal their true selves. But the only sound that breaks the quiet is the crackle of burning logs. Step closer still, and the details sharpen. Above the mantelpiece, a stag's head stares down, its empty sockets like dark secrets. To the side, a tapestry sleeve is pulled back, revealing a scene of two knights locked in fierce battle. Their armor is a study in contrast, polished steel versus burnished gold, just like the two sides of the noble life. Polished steel versus burnished gold, just like the two sides of the noble life. The lady of the manor, she sits by the far wall, her fingers nimble as she threads a tapestry needle. Her world is one of vibrant colors and soft textures, a stark contrast to the muted tones and hard edges of the men's world. This is her sanctuary, a space filled with the comforting rhythm of her work and the soft murmur of conversation. The tapestry in her hands tells a story, but it's one she'll never finish. Her fingers move mechanically, her eyes staring into the distance. The vibrant colors blur together, the patterns and textures of the cloth losing definition until it all fades to gray. Her mind is elsewhere, lost in a world of silks and satins, jewels and jades, where her daughters will be married off to the highest bidders, her sons pawns in a game of power and prestige. As night falls, the hall comes alive with flickering candlelight. The long table is laden with food fit for a feast, roasted boar, venison, pies filled with exotic spices and plump with succulent meat. Goblets of wine sit nestled between platters piled high with crusty bread and bowls of fruit. It's a bounty that speaks of wealth and privilege, a testament to the Lord's success in managing his lands and resources. But beyond the bounty, there's a sense of foreboding, a feeling that something is amiss. The boar, it's a symbol of excess, a creature of instinct and appetite, much like the nobles who feast upon it. And as the lords and ladies dig in, their laughter echoing through the hall. Their voices grow louder, their words more cutting. The merriment turns to mockery, the feast becomes a battleground. Accusations are hurled like sharpened knives, secrets are spilled like wine, and the air grows thick with tension. Suddenly, a goblet crashes to the floor, shattering the fragile peace. The room falls silent, every eye drawn to the broken vessel at their feet, and in that moment they know the feast is over. The game has begun. Welcome to the channel. When you think of medieval life, what comes to mind? For many, it's a world of chivalry and valor, of knights in shining armor and daring quests. But what about the quieter moments, the everyday life of medieval nobility? Join us as we take a closer look at the Great Hall, not as a place of boisterous feasts, but as a microcosm of medieval life, where power, dynamics, social norms, and personal dramas all play out against a backdrop of flickering candlelight and the scent of wood smoke. The nobility also enjoyed pursuits of leisure. Hunting was a favored pastime. Imagine the lord and his retinue riding out at dawn, hounds at their side, horns sounding softly in the morning mist. It was both a sport and a statement of dominance over the land, a reminder that the forest and its creatures belonged to the Lord. Falconry, too, offered a graceful diversion. A falcon resting on a gloved hand, its keen eyes watching the skies. Then, of course, there were the feasts. These gatherings displayed wealth and reinforced social order. Picture a long evening meal, dishes of venison, roasted fowl, and fresh bread carried in by servants. The air is rich with the scent of spiced wine and stews. Minstrels might play softly on lutes, their melodies weaving through the conversation. The lord at the head of the table raises a cup of silver. Conversation is formal, often about alliances, disputes, or local news. For the guests, it is both a social event and a subtle performance of status. Life in the Middle Ages wasn't just about hard labor and religious devotion. The nobility had their share of fun, too. What better way to unwind than with a good hunt? I'm not talking about a quick jaunt to the local supermarket for some pheasant and a pack of cigarettes. No, sir, this was the real deal. A full-on expedition into the heart of the wilderness. The lord would wake up before sunrise, not because he was an early bird, but because his hunt was scheduled for dawn. The animals, you see, were most active then, and also because the temperature was bearable. Hunting in the sweltering heat or the biting cold wasn't anyone's idea of a good time. So off they'd go, the lord and his retinue, accompanied by a bevy of servants, each with a specific task. Some would carry extra hounds, those eager, noisy canines who'd go wild at the mere whiff of a chase. Others would bring along food and drink. Because a hunting expedition wasn't just about the quarry, it was also about enjoying the day. And don't forget the men-at-arms. Hunting, after all, was a dangerous business. One wrong move, and the prey could turn predator, goring, slashing, or simply running away. So the men-at-arms were there to ensure everyone came back alive, or at least with as many fingers and limbs as they started with. The hunt itself was a carefully orchestrated affair. The dogs would be set upon the unsuspecting animals, and then it was a matter of speed, skill, and a bit of luck. The Lord might take a keen interest in the chase, urging the dogs on, shouting encouragement, or issuing commands. But he was also careful not to exert himself too much. After all, he was a nobleman, not a commoner. Why, while his men might break into a sweat, the Lord would keep his movements measured, his breathing steady, and his eyes sharp for the moment when he could claim his prize. When the quarry was finally caught, there would be a brief pause, a moment of triumph, before the work began. The animal, usually a deer, would be skinned and butchered, and the meat would be shared among the retinue. It was a reminder of their success, a tangible reward for their efforts. And let's not forget the antlers. These were carefully removed and later turned into decorative items or weapons. Nothing went to waste. But hunting wasn't just about the food or the trophies. It was also a way of life, a ritual that bound the nobility to the land and to each other. It was a test of skill, a display of wealth, and a reminder of their place in the hierarchy of medieval society. As the sun began its slow descent, the hunters would return to the castle, their horses laden with game, their heads held high. They had tamed the wilderness, and now they were ready to tame the dinner table. Ah, yes, the feast. A staple of medieval life, a celebration of abundance, and a display of power. Imagine it, if you will, a great hall filled with the aroma of roasted meats, spiced wines, and freshly baked bread. Long wooden tables groaning under the weight of platters piled high with venison, roasted boar, and plump chickens. Servants glide through the crowd, offering more food and drink. Their movements are practiced, their smiles polite. The air is thick with the murmur of conversation, the clink of silverware, and the soft strum of a lute. Minstrels wander among the tables, their voices weaving tales of valor and love. At the head of the table sits the Lord, his posture straight, his eyes alert. He is the center of attention, and he knows it. His every word is weighed, his every gesture studied. For this is not just a meal, it's a performance. The other nobles are no different. They come to the feast to show off their finery, their wit, and their status. They exchange pleasantries, discuss local politics, and maybe, just maybe, make a few deals. All the while, they keep an eye on the Lord. After all, he has the power to make or break their fortunes. As the evening wears on, the mood lightens. The wine flows freely, and the nobles begin to relax. There's laughter now, and even the occasional jest. But it's a carefully calibrated performance. Everyone is on their best behavior. No one wants to offend the Lord or make an enemy of a fellow noble. Suddenly, the door opens, and a new guest enters. All eyes turn to him, and the room falls silent. It's the king. And when the king arrives, everyone must bow before him. Even the Lord must defer to his royal highness. For now, this is no longer just a feast. It's a royal affair. And so the evening continues, with the king regaling everyone with tales of his exploits, the nobles hanging on his every word. It's a night of celebration, of camaraderie, and of power. And when it's over, everyone goes home with a deeper sense of their place in the grand scheme of things. They've feasted like kings, and they'll remember it for years to come. Hey there, welcome to this house. Yet for all its grandeur, life in the manor was not free of worries. Behind the luxury lay responsibilities. The Lord was expected to provide protection for his tenants, to lead men in times of conflict, and to maintain the delicate balance of feudal obligations. The lady in turn bore the burden of ensuring the household ran smoothly. And though the walls were strong, famine, rebellion, or plague could still reach within. To a serf, looking upon the manor might inspire awe, envy, or resentment. It stood as a symbol of the hierarchy that bound society together, one world dependent upon the other. Without the serf's labor, the manor's tables could not be filled. Without the manor's authority, the fields might fall into disorder. It was a relationship marked by tension and necessity, inequality and interdependence. Let's take a closer look inside. So we find ourselves in the Great Hall. It is a large, echoing space with a high vaulted ceiling. In the best period dramas, the ceilings are decorated with paintings or frescoes, but here they are merely white. In truth, many manors would not have been so ostentatiously decorated. Those decorations are reserved for the great chateaux and palaces of the nobility. But some lords might commission artwork if they are particularly proud of their lineage, or if they are trying to make a good impression on important guests. The room is dominated by a long, heavy table made of dark wood. It is surrounded by high-backed chairs upholstered in leather and decorated with the family crest. At the far end of the table sits a raised dais, where the lord and his lady will sit. The dais is decorated with a cloth bearing the family's colors, in this case, red and gold. Above it hangs a large tapestry depicting a mythical battle between good and evil. These tapestries were often the source of great pride for the families who owned them. As they were expensive to produce and displayed the family's wealth and power, on the walls hang a variety of weapons, including swords, maces, and shields, all carefully cleaned and polished. They are not just for show, however, but serve as a reminder to all who enter the hall of the Lord's duty to protect his people. At the far end of the hall is a large fireplace, flanked by 2 suits of armor. The armor is not just for display, but is worn by men-at-arms when they are not on duty. Through an archway at the far end of the room, we can see a glimpse of the kitchen. The kitchen is a busy place, with servants moving about, preparing food for the Lord and his guests. The air is filled with the smells of roasting meat and baking bread. We now enter the solar, also known as the Lord's chamber or the withdrawing room. This is where the lord of the manor relaxes in his private quarters. The room is furnished with a large bed, a writing desk, and a variety of chairs and stools. The bed is covered with a heavy quilt, and the walls are lined with bookshelves filled with books on a variety of subjects. The room is warm and inviting, and the lord of the manor is clearly a man of some wealth and culture. We now visit the ladies' chamber. The room is similar to the Lord's chamber, but with a few key differences. The bed is smaller and more delicate, and the bookshelves are replaced with chests of drawers and a vanity table. The lady of the manor is clearly a woman of some style and grace, and her chamber reflects her status and personality. Finally, we come to the chapel. The chapel is a small, quiet room with a single altar and a few benches. It is a place where the Lord and his family can come to pray and reflect. The chapel is well maintained, but it is clear that it is rarely used. The lord of the manor may be a devout Christian, but he is also a busy man. He has a kingdom to run and a family to protect. There is little time for prayer and contemplation. So ends our tour of the manor house. I hope you enjoyed seeing this way of life brought to life. Till next time, goodbye. In the grand tapestry of history, few threads are as enduring, as influential as that of the feudal system. It thrived for centuries, shaping not just the way people lived, but also how they died, believed, and dreamed. As we've journeyed through this medieval world, we've walked in the mud-caked. Boots of the serf tilled the soil under the scorching sun, harvested the bounty of the land, all the while paying homage to the rhythm of seasons and the whims of weather. We've also reveled in the opulence of the nobility, sipped wine from goblets, feasted on delicacies, witnessed the pageantry of royal courts. And so, in feudal France, 2 very different rhythms of life unfolded side by side: the weary, muddy cycle of the serf and the ceremonial, lavish routines of the nobility. Each was incomplete without the other. Together they form the fabric of medieval society. As our journey draws to a close, we can step back and reflect on these contrasts, on the hardship and the privilege, the sameness and the splendor. From the soil-stained hands of peasants to the jewel-studded halls of lords, all were bound together in a system that defined centuries of European history. But why did the feudal system last so long? Why did it take so long for the nobility to relinquish their centuries-old privileges? The answer, my friends, lies in the practicality of this seemingly rigid structure. For the nobility, the feudal system was a well-oiled machine that kept the gears of power turning smoothly. They held the reins of authority, yes, but in return, they had to maintain an image, uphold a lifestyle that demanded constant upkeep. Think of it as a high-stakes game of musical chairs. The music, the merry tunes of celebration and conquest, played on as long as the nobility kept their seats. But the moment they faltered, lost even a fraction of their lavish lifestyle, their grip on power would weaken. And that, my keen observers, was something they were loath to risk. The peasant, or, as they were more bluntly called, the serf, toiled in the fields. Their lives were a cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting. The soil was their world. Its fertility dictated their survival. No matter the hardship, no matter the famine, or lordly whim, they returned to the fields. It was their duty, their whole world. Now let's shift our gaze to the great halls of the nobles. There amidst the tapestries and the torchlight we see another world unfolding, a world of strategy, of alliances and rivalries. For the nobility, life was a game of constant negotiation. They were married off in strategic unions, forming alliances that secured their power. Tournaments were more than just games. They were showcases of skill, bravery, and lineage. Each victory, each strategic move, was a statement, a testament to their prowess and lineage. As we near the end of our journey, we find ourselves contemplating the longevity of this system. Why did it persist for so long? The answer, dear viewers, is as multifaceted as the characters that populate our series. The feudal system was a pragmatic dance of necessity and self-preservation. The nobility clung to their privileges not out of pure-hearted love for tradition, but because those privileges were the very foundation of their power. To relinquish them would be to risk everything they had worked generations to attain. But alas, all good things must come to an end. Or perhaps we could say that some things must end for others to begin. The feudal system, like a stubborn old oak, resisted the winds of change for centuries. But around it, the world was shifting. New ideas, new opportunities were sprouting. And as the soil of Europe tilled with new ways of thinking, the seeds of change took root. The French Revolution, a seismic event, cracked the foundations of this old order. As the nobility lost their privileged place in society, the rigid structure that had defined medieval France began to crumble. But remember, dear viewers, history is not just about the fall of systems. It's also about the resilience of the human spirit. It's about how from the ashes of the old, the new is born. So as we bid adieu to our journey through feudal France, know that we are not just saying goodbye to a time and place, we are also marking the beginning of a new understanding. It's a deeper appreciation for the complexities of our past and the strength of the human spirit to adapt and evolve. From the fields of labor to the courts of kings, each scene, each character has contributed to the rich tapestry of history. It is now time to weave these threads of knowledge into the fabric of your understanding. As you step out of this medieval world and back into your own, carry with you the lessons learned, the stories experienced. Let them be your guide as you navigate the complexities of our modern world. Just as the French peasantry and nobility once shaped an era, so too will you shape the world around you. In the 14th century, a young woman named Agnes lived her life in a French village. Like many others, she had no idea that she was living through one of the most deadly plagues in human history, known today as the Black Death. As years passed, she continued to wake up before dawn, tend to her vegetable garden, care for her children and animals, and eat meals with her family at dusk. She worked hard as a weaver, making cloth that she and her neighbors needed. Occasionally, her small village came alive with festivals and markets, where merchants sold colorful fabrics and juicy fruit. But mostly her life was peaceful, until one day it wasn't. You're listening to The History of the World in 100 Objects. In about 1347, when Agnes was around 25 years old, ships docked at Sicilian ports carrying a cargo of rats and fleas. No one knew it yet, but they brought with them the deadliest souvenir imaginable. A few weeks later, people started dying in Sicily, then in southern France. Within a year, over 500,000 people were dead. Those who survived found themselves asking, who will take care of the dying, and how can we bury so many bodies? So many families lost both parents. Children wandered the streets calling out for someone to help them. Some thought God was angry because people weren't praying enough. Others blamed Jews for poisoning wells. Still others thought the end of the world was happening just like it was described in the Bible. Those who escaped death in the first wave of the plague were often infected in a second wave the following year. People became so desperate that they took drastic measures to protect themselves. For example, some carried around flowers like roses and chamomile because they believed these scents could purify the air. Wearing charms and amulets also became very popular. Others wore clothes backwards so they wouldn't touch the soiled front of their clothing. In reality, the only thing that would stop the spread of disease was soap. But people didn't know that back then. One person who might have known more than others was Guy de Chauliac, a surgeon who wrote a medical textbook during the plague. He saw firsthand how the disease ravaged the human body, and he recorded what he saw. He described painful swellings under people's armpits and around their groin, as well as black spots on their skin. Even though he couldn't cure the sick, he understood that the disease spread through fleas and rats. He recommended cleaning streets and homes and avoiding contact with sick people. Though many followed his advice, the plague raged for another 5 years, killing an estimated 25 million people, or about 30 to 60% of the population in some areas. It finally ended in 1353. But what does this mean for you? Imagine you're walking along a street lined with houses. On one side, you see the home of a wealthy merchant. Inside, a family dines on roasted meats and spiced wine. They don't have to worry about where their next meal will come from. They have enough money to hire servants. To take care of their home and children, their kids will probably live comfortable lives too. As you walk further, you pass by a bakery, a blacksmith, and a house where a tanner works with leather. The workers and their families can make a decent living. They have enough money to buy food and raise children. Most of them have a good relationship with their bosses, and their kids will likely have a decent life too. As you pass by a tavern, you hear loud voices coming from inside. A group of men is arguing about who has to pay for the drinks. One of them is a peasant, and he's upset that his lord raised the price of bread. If he can't afford bread, he won't be able to feed his family. And if his children don't eat, they will get sick and die. He doesn't understand why the Lord wants more money from him. All he knows is that he has to do something to take care of his family. Before long, you come to a large, imposing castle. This is the Lord's home. Inside, the Lord and his knights plan how to defend their lands from invaders. They have weapons to protect themselves and their people, and they believe it's their duty to keep the peace. They are important members of society, and they take pride in their work. The 3 people you met on your walk represent 3 different social classes in medieval Europe. At the top of the social pyramid was the nobility. The nobility owned most of the land and had a lot of power. They didn't have to work because they owned property that produced wealth. They employed people to manage their estates when they went to war or to court. Sometimes the nobility fought in wars, led armies, and kept people safe. Other times they were involved in politics, working with kings and queens to make laws and solve problems. Because they were at the top of society, their lives were usually pretty easy. They had access to the best food and other luxuries like beautiful clothes and jewelry. Below the nobility were merchants and artisans. Merchants bought and sold goods. Artisans made goods by hand, like cobblers who made shoes or weavers who made cloth. Often their jobs depended on the nobility. For example, if a lord didn't go to war, a blacksmith wouldn't need to make weapons. Or if a king didn't order new tapestries for his castle, a weaver wouldn't have work. Sometimes merchants and artisans were able to save money and become wealthy, and they might be able to buy land and become nobles. The bottom of society were the peasants. Peasants were the backbone of medieval society. They grew crops and took care of farm animals. They also worked as domestic servants, or did crafts like weaving or pottery. They got most of their food from their farms, but sometimes they had to buy food from merchants. And that was expensive, because the merchants knew that peasants didn't have much money. Sometimes peasants could save enough money to buy their freedom, but most peasants were born into their social class and couldn't do anything to change it. If you were a peasant, you'd probably live in a small village. Your house would be a simple hut made of wood or stone. You might share a wall with your neighbor and cook your food over an open fire. There would be little furniture and few windows. Most of the time you'd be working. You'd take care of crops and livestock. You'd also have to complete tasks for your lord, like building a road or collecting firewood. You'd pay your lord rent and give him part of your food. Sometimes you'd be able to attend feasts or festivals, but usually your life would be pretty boring. If you got sick or injured, there would be no one to take care of you. If you died, no one would mourn for long. That's just the way life was for a peasant. If you were a merchant or artisan, your life would be better. You could make your own hours and set your own prices. You could travel and meet new people. You could also get rich, but you might have to work long hours to make a living. If you were a noble, your life would be the best. You could enjoy all the luxuries you wanted. You could also use your power to help people or hurt them. Now imagine that the Black Death comes to your village. what would happen to you? If you were a peasant, you'd probably die. The plague killed most of the people at the bottom of society. As a peasant, you worked long hours and didn't have much money. You also lived in crowded conditions. It made it easy for the disease to spread. If you were a merchant or artisan, you might be able to protect your family. You could afford to buy nicer food and live in better houses. It meant you and your family were less likely to get sick. You could also leave town if things got bad. If you were a noble, you'd probably survive too. You had access to good food and health care, and you weren't usually in town when the plague hit. By the 1300s, most of Europe had been affected by the plague at least once. It killed millions of people and changed society forever. When the plague hit, everyone was affected. People were scared and confused. They didn't understand what caused the plague or how to treat it. They also had to deal with the aftermath of the plague. Many families lost both parents, and children were left without anyone to take care of them. Some people blamed Jews for poisoning wells, while others said the end of the world was happening. Even though the plague was terrible, it also led to some positive changes. For example, people started to question the authority of the church. Before the plague, most Europeans were very religious. They believed that God was punishing them and that the church could help them avoid punishment. But after the plague, people started to think differently. They wondered why God would let such a terrible thing happen. They also realized that the church couldn't protect them from death. As a result, people became less religious and more interested in science and reason. This change in thinking helped lead to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. So remember, even though the plague was horrible, it also had some positive effects. The plague was a turning point in European history. It marked the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance. It also led to major changes in the economy, society, and culture. When you think about the plague, remember that it was a terrible tragedy that killed millions of people. But it was also an important event that shaped our world today. Thanks for listening. If you want to learn more about the plague, you can click here to read a book. If you enjoyed this episode, please like it. If you want to listen to more episodes, you can click here, or you can click here to listen to one of our other shows. Thanks for listening.